We are in a series titled Exodus, looking through the book of Exodus, and my sermon today is titled, If God Calls, Then We Can. Tell your neighbor that. If God calls, then we can. Because that's the truth. If God calls us, then we can do whatever he calls us to do. It doesn't matter what other people think. It doesn't matter what we think about ourselves. The only thing that matters is that God called us. And so as I was preparing and looking through these scriptures, I began to think about God's will for my life. You see, whenever I go through a transition period, and I've been kind of through a transition period the last couple of years, having come back from Colorado and just going through the pandemic and just doing everything I've been doing, I periodically like to say, God, what is your will for my life? What are you calling me to do right now? Right? That's a pretty important question to have answered. But once God's calling is clear, I think there's a follow-up question that perhaps might be even more important, and that is, what hinders me from fulfilling that calling? What would hold me up? What would keep me from walking in God's calling? Because if I know what I'm supposed to do, and I can overcome those hindrances, then God's calling has this galvanizing effect in my life, and I can align my resources. I can put every bit of effort and strength into getting it done. And what about you? What about you? What's God's will for your life? What's God calling you to do right now in this season? What does he want you to do? What has he impressed on your heart? But more importantly, once God's calling is clear to you, what hinders you from embracing that calling? What hinders you from living out God's will in your life? Well, near as I can tell, especially as it relates to what we're going to study today in Exodus chapter 4, there are two things that hinder us from embracing God's call. The first thing is what others think about us. And the second thing is what we think about ourselves. You see, there's some of us here today who know what God's will for our life is. He's been speaking to us, and he wants us to go, and he wants us to do something. It might not be something like ministry or leading an exodus out of your workplace or something like that, right? But God is asking you to do something. He's impressed upon your heart, and however ordinary it may be, he has called you to do that. But if you allow what other people think, if we allow what other people think about us to creep in and hinder us from moving forward, we're going to be stalled. Maybe we worry too much that we don't have what it takes. Maybe we think, we're not enough. We've failed in the past. We've missed too many opportunities. Our ship has sailed. And so that tends to hinder us as well. Well, fortunately, we're not the first people to have struggled with these things. And today, we're going to learn that Moses also struggled with these thoughts. But in the end, Moses left his regret. He left his failure. He left everything that hindered him, what others thought about him, whether or not they believed, whether or not they would support him, what he thought about himself. Was he enough? Did he have what it takes? He left all of that at the mountain of God and moved forward, knowing that if God called him to do something, then he could do whatever God asked him to do, and we can do the same. If God calls us, then we can. Turn with me to Exodus chapter 4. Let's read through this chapter together. And that way, as I refer to it, you know where I'm at. Okay, let's take a look. Exodus chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. But Moses protested again. What if they won't believe me or listen to me? What if they say the Lord never appeared to you? And then the Lord asked him, what is that in your hand? A shepherd's staff, Moses replied. Throw it on the ground, the Lord told him. So Moses threw down the staff and it turned into a snake. Moses jumped back. Then the Lord told him, reach out and grab its tail. So Moses threw down the staff and it turned into a snake. Oops, sorry about that. Then the Lord told him, reach out and grab its tail. So Moses reached out and grabbed it, and it turned back into a shepherd's staff in his hand. Verse 5, perform this sign, the Lord told him. Then they will believe that the Lord, the God of their ancestors, really has appeared to you. And then the Lord said to Moses, now put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand inside his coat, and when he took it out again, it was as white as snow with a severe skin disease. Now put your hand back into your coat, the Lord said. So Moses put his hand back in, and when he took it out again, it was as healthy as the rest of his body. The Lord said to Moses, they do not believe you and are not convinced by the first miraculous sign, they will be convinced by the second. And if they don't believe you or listen to you, even after these two signs, then take some water from the Nile and pour it on the ground. And when you do, the water from the Nile will turn to blood on the ground. But Moses pleaded with the Lord, oh Lord, I'm not very good with words. I never have been, and I'm not now. Even though you've spoken to me, I get tongue-tied and my words get tangled. And then the Lord asked Moses, who makes a person's mouth? Who decides whether people speak or do not speak, hear, do not hear, see, or do not see? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you in what to say. But Moses again pleaded, Lord, please send someone else. Then the Lord became angry with Moses. All right, he said, what about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he speaks well, and look, he's on his way to meet you now, and he will be delighted to see you. Talk to him, put the words in his mouth. I will be with both of you as you speak, and I will instruct you both on what to do. Aaron will be your spokesman to the people. He will be your mouthpiece, and you will stand in the place of God for him, telling him what to say, and take your shepherd's staff with you, and use it to perform the miraculous signs I've shown you. Skip up to verse 29. Then Moses and Aaron returned to Egypt and called all the elders of Israel together. Aaron told them everything the Lord had told Moses, and Moses performed the miraculous signs as they watched. And then the people of Israel were convinced that the Lord had sent Moses and Aaron. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshiped. Pastor Sean, would you grab that tea right there for me, please? Thank you so much. So when I start studying, thank you, sir. When I start studying, I like to consider, well, what is the context? Okay, and if you were here last week, you know that we just picked up chapter 4, all right, a conversation between God and Moses, but we're stepping into the middle of it. Okay, we're stepping into the middle of their conversation. This conversation started back in chapter 3. This conversation started back in chapter 3. And if you read the beginning of chapter 3, if you want to just turn the page back, you'll see that Moses is far into the wilderness. He's near the mountain of God. Now, whether or not he intended to be there, I kind of think he did, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. He was near Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai, if you remember, is where Moses received the 10 Commandments after he led the people out of Israel. So he's out far in the wilderness near the mountain of God. And when we find him in Exodus chapter 3, he is but a shadow of his former self. So you might not know this, but back in the day when he was a younger man, Moses was extremely well educated. He was powerful in speech. He was powerful in action. In fact, some extra biblical literature suggests that he was a general in the Egyptian army and had just finished leading them to a tremendous victory over the Ethiopians. And so Moses was very prominent. He was well known. He was strong. He was powerful. He had a lot going for him. And so having recognized that God had a call in his life, Hebrews tells us that Moses came to a place in his life where he recognized that God wanted to do something great with him. And he separated himself from the Egyptians. He says that he would rather be counted among the Hebrew slaves than to continue enjoying the privilege of being an Egyptian prince. He separated, and for that, he was known as a a hero of the faith. He stepped out. He tried to live out that calling, and yet he failed. He tried to deliver the Israelites from slavery when he was about 40 years old. That didn't go well, right? Not only did the Israelites reject his leadership, but he alienated himself from the Egyptians as well. And so he did the only thing he could do at that point. He ran into the desert. You know, I'm always amazed how quickly a person's life can turn from good times to hard times. It's really amazing how quickly it can do that. Well, speaking of hard times, you know, it's been kind of cold out lately, hasn't it? Is it still kind of cold out? This morning I've been inside the church. You know, it's been cold out, and I've been wanting to wear a scarf, okay? But I've been having a hard time putting it on. On my head, I don't know, I just can't get my head around it or something like that. Some of y'all are going to get that on the way home. I see a few of you got that. A few of you got that. That's another lame dad joke. God just pulled that out once in a while. Seriously, though, I think Moses was having a hard time getting his head around what just happened in his life. I mean, Moses tried to fulfill God's will, and he failed. And worse yet, he didn't even know why he failed. He thought he had everything going for him. He thought he was perfectly positioned to get this done, and he failed. I'm sure he didn't even know why. He probably felt like he missed his opportunity. And to be honest, I think this really depressed Moses at times. I mean, 40 years is a long time to feel like a failure. He flees from Egypt into the desert. He doesn't know anybody. He goes out there, and for 40 years, he's feeling like he missed it. He's feeling like he just missed his whole opportunity. He turned left when God wanted him to turn right, and now he's on his own. And so when God speaks to Moses out of the burning bush, I think he's speaking to a man who's pretty weighed down. I have to wonder, in fact, if that morning when he got up to tend the sheep, he talked to his wife and said, you know what, I might not be back today. I've got to deal with something. I've got to deal with something. I'm going out to the mountain of God because I can't live like this anymore. I can't be weighed down with this regret, with this feeling like a failure anymore. I've got to get some answers. I've got to go find God. And so when God speaks to him that day, God's not speaking to a handsome, powerful, inspiring general. He's speaking to a lonely, lowly shepherd who lacks confidence in himself and believes his best years are behind him. God is speaking to a man who in many ways is a slave to regret and failure. See, I think that God knew that before Moses could set anyone else free, he himself needed to be set free. He himself needed a personal exodus. Sometimes we need that too. I think understanding where Moses was is critical to understanding and interpreting Moses' response to God. You see, when we first read through that, we give Moses a hard time. We look at him and we're like, dude, God is speaking to you from a bush. Like, how can you not respond to this? How can you not just be, yeah, whatever you want me to do? But we have to understand where Moses has been, what he has gone through, what he has lived with, the weight he's been carrying this whole time. And so as we interpret Moses' response, we can also come to understand why God was so patient with Moses. We see God just working through this conversation both in chapter 3 and in chapter 4. And for any of us who have ever walked through a season of life where you feel like a failure for any period of time, you know that the last thing you need is someone getting on you. You know that you need someone to be patient with you and help you kind of sort through these things. And in this case, Moses was sorting through two things. He was sorting through what others thought about him, and he was sorting through what he thought about himself. Let's look at this conversation again in chapter 4. Now, in your sermon notes, you'll see I have out a table there for you, and I've divided these verses into three sections, verses 1 through 9, 10 through 17, and then 29 through 31. And so you can follow along as I kind of make these points. Let's take a look at this first section, verses 1 through 9, where Moses is concerned about what others think. You know, someone once said, you wouldn't worry so much about what others think of you if you realize just how seldom they actually do. I think that's true. See, in verses 1 through 9, Moses he's looking out. He's focused on other people. God is saying, Moses, I've got a call on your life. I've got something for you to do. Here's my will for your life. And Moses is like, yeah, that's great, but I can't do that because they won't believe. And at first glance, we might say, what are you talking about? God's speaking to you. But you have to remember that 40 years earlier, Moses tried to deliver them. Moses stepped up. He tried to act out. He tried to lead them out of Egypt, and he failed. They actually rejected his leadership. They said, who put you in charge of us? And so now Moses, he's looking at himself and thinking, man, if they rejected me when I was at my best, when I was powerful in speech and action, I was a general, was clean shaven, had a lot of good things going for me, God, what makes you think they will listen to me now? You know, I look like a hobo out here. I haven't led in 40 years. I can't speak well anymore. All these reasons. What makes you think that they're going to listen to me? But God's response to him was to stop and to start. Look at verse 2 again. God says, what do you have? As if to turn his attention. God doesn't even address the fact that he's worried about others. He says, no, right back here, what do you have? As if to say, put your focus on right here, right now. Don't worry about what they think. Stop worrying about what others think and start using what you have right here, right now to fulfill my will in your life. And so God says, hey, what's that in your hand? Moses says, a staff. You ever wonder about that? God says, what do you have? I have a staff. That staff, do you know what that staff represented? That staff represented 40 years in the wilderness. 40 years of feeling like a failure. God says, what do you have? I'll use it. Throw it down. Pick it up. What's that at the end of your arms? You got two hands, right? Put one in your coat. Take it out. Put it back. Take it out again. You got a cup, right? Go get some water from the Nile. Pour it out. Notice the simplicity of all of these things. It's like God was leaving him absolutely no excuse to get started. I mean, these things are so simple that even a child could do them, right? How many of you like walking? You like going hiking in the woods? What do you do when you go out in the woods if you don't have hiking poles? You look for a stick, right? A hiking stick is just a special stick that you found on the ground, right? Same with a staff. It's nothing extraordinary. It's just a stick. And God says, hey, that's okay. I'll use the ordinary things in your life to do extraordinary things. And what do you find, Moses? What does he use that staff? As you read through his story, when he goes out to the Red Sea, what does he lift up? His staff. When he goes out into the wilderness, he hits the rock. He uses that staff for all sorts of great things. So what does this mean for us? Well, when we have those burning bush moments and God comes to us and says, this is my will for you, and his calling on our life is so clear, but because we maybe have been living in a place where we don't feel, where we are very, very worried about what others think, maybe we tried before and failed. God says, wait, stop worrying about other people. Some of you need to hear that this morning. Some of us need to hear that. He's saying to us right now, don't worry about what other people think. Start right now, right where you're at, with what you have. The Apostle Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7, that we now have God's light shining in our hearts, but we ourselves are like what? Fragile clay jars containing this great treasure. I bet Moses felt a little fragile that day. But why does God use people like Moses in that state? Why does God use people like us when we're feeling broken down? Because, Paul answers, he said, this makes it clear that our great power is from God and not from ourselves. See, when Moses went into Egypt and began to deliver the people, and the plagues came, and they went through the Red Sea, and the manna came, and then the partridges came, and then the water from the rock, all these great things. Do you ever think they looked at Moses and thought, man, he's so inspiring, you know, he's so handsome, or he's so powerful, what a general. No, it was none of that. He came very lowly, couldn't speak very well. In fact, Aaron had to speak for him. Why did God do that? So that God would get all the credit and the Israelites' attention would be totally on God. And I think that the same is true for us. If we want God to truly use our lives in extraordinary ways, once we get past what other people think and allow God to start using the ordinary aspects of our life to do extraordinary things, do you think he wants us to get the credit for that? Not at all. He gets the credit for that. And so this is where Moses was. And I think this is where a lot of us find ourselves these days. He's focused on worrying. We get focused on worrying. And if we're not careful, we'll let it hinder us from fulfilling God's will in our lives. Let's look at the second set of verses 10 through 17. So God comes to Moses and said, hey, this is my will for you. I've got a calling on your life. I've got somebody that really needs your help. And he's first like, oh, what about them? They won't believe. God says, no, don't worry about that. Just get started. And he says, well, I cannot speak well. As if to say, Lord, I am not enough. Notice what he says. Look back at that verse. He says, I'm not good with words. I never have been. Now, you and I know that that's not true. But 40 years in the desert feeling like a failure tends to make a person forget some things. It's been a long time since Moses was an inspiring general. It's been a long time since he's led a conquest or led anything other than sheep. And so he's at a different place in his life. He don't even remember those days. But what was God's response to Moses? In looking at it, we find that it's both rhetorical and reassuring. Notice what God says. He says, who made you? Who makes a person's mouth? Who decides whether someone can speak or not speak, hear or not hear, or see or not see? As if to say, who made you, Moses? Who brought you here? And now who's calling you somewhere else? It's me. Furthermore, and here's the reassuring part, notice what God says. He says, Moses, I am with you. I am with you, as if to say, Moses, if you were enough, then you wouldn't need me. I am your enough. Do you remember in chapter 3, Moses asked, well, who should I say sent me? What does God say? Tell him I am sent you. And here God is saying, listen, Moses, I am your enough. Don't worry, I'm with you. I'll make up for whatever you lack. In fact, I'll send your brother Aaron with you. He can speak for you. And so when I think about what does this mean for us, I think God, when we get in this place where we're feeling like we're not enough to fulfill what God has asked us to do, however simple it might be or however grandiose it might be, whenever we get in that place, I think God starts asking us some rhetorical questions like, who made us? Who made all our delicate inner parts? Who knit us together in our mother's womb? God did. Who's been with us since our births? God has. Who knows when we sit down, when we rise up? Who knows when we travel and when we rest at home? Who knows what we are going to say even before we say it? God does. And so when we get in this mode where we really are filled with self-doubt and feeling like we're not enough, and this is the reason why we cannot fulfill God's will in our lives, why we cannot begin to fulfill his calling, we need to remember something. We need to remember that God knows us better than we know ourselves. How many of you say amen to that? God knows us better than we know ourselves. And so when he calls us to do something, then we have to assume that he knows who we are and what we are and are not capable of. When God called Moses, he knew exactly who he was. He knew he was rough. He knew he was a murderer. You remember that part of his story? He knew exactly what Moses had been through. And so it wasn't Moses' estimation of himself that mattered. It was God's. And the same is true for us. When God calls us, when God asks us to do something, when we have that burning bush experience with him, and we're there in God's presence, and God says, hey, I want you to do this. Somebody needs your help. And we say, I can't. I'm not enough. We have to remember that it's not our estimation of ourselves that matters. It's God. Because evidently, God took everything into consideration and still asked us to do the job. He thought about it, and he still asked us. See, if God calls, then we can because he is with us. He will make up for our inadequacies. The fact that God calls us qualifies us for that job. Not whether we think we're enough. Moses was never enough. Even at his best, he was not enough. His first effort, what did he do? How many Egyptians did he take out? One. How well did that go? Not very good. He was never enough, not even in his best days. And the same is true for us. Even when we're at our best, we are not qualified to do what God calls us to do. It is his calling that qualifies us. It's the fact that God asks us to do something that enables us to do that job. So let me take a moment to directly apply this to your life. What does this mean for you? What is your first steps? Well, the first thing that came to my mind when studying this out is that you need to spend less time regretting your mistakes and more time moving forward. You need to spend less time regretting your mistakes and more time moving forward. You see, I think as I converse with people, counsel with people, hear their stories, I find that a lot of people, they view God's will for their life as this like singular path. That when they stray from it or if they miss it somehow, then the rest of their life is messed up. Like, I just missed God's will. And now somewhere or another, I'm just on my own. I'm living God's secondary will or his tertiary will. Or I'm off on my own right now. I just really missed it. And you know, that weighs a person down. That was weighing Moses down. And when people, that's why I think part of what the Lord wanted me to share with you this morning is this right here. That God's will for your life is not singular in nature. See, God's got plans like my wife's got recipes. I don't know about your wife, but my wife's got a recipe book this thick. And it don't matter what's in our kitchen. She can whip up something good, right? And that's the same thing for you. It doesn't matter where you're at. It doesn't matter what you've been through, what you've done, what you haven't done, where your education is, how prominent you've been. Maybe you're anonymous. Maybe you're not well known. It doesn't matter because God's got a plan that he can whip up for you no matter where you're at. Listen to Jeremiah 29, verse 11. He says, "For I know the plan I have for you." Is that right? No. He says, "I know the plans," as in plural, "that I have for you. They are plans of good and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope." God's got several plans for you. I like what Pastor Erwin McManus says out in Mosaic. He says God's got many plans for you, and he's in every single one of them. Every single one. God is always looking to give you a future and a hope. I mean, really, do you think a God that would send his one and only son to die on a cross to take the punishment for your sins would look at you and say, well, that's it. I mean, you missed it. You turned left, but it says right here, my plan says you should have turned right. Oh, well, I guess you're on your own now. Do your best. See ya. Well, does God say that? No, that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. I think God is kind of like our Maps app, you know? You pull out your Maps app and you're like, Siri, get me home. Siri, get me to the grocery store or something. You know, you ask Siri something. And she's telling you which way to go. And if you miss your turn, what does Siri do? Oh, you moron, you should have turned left. See ya. No, she don't do that. What does she do? She recalculates. She finds another way to get you where you need to go. And I think God is exactly that way. If we turn left when we should have gone right, God, he just recalculates. God is, we just tend to limit God. We think God is so smart. We put more trust in Siri than we put in God. We do. God knows how to get you where you need to go. He's got plans for you. He's in every single one. I pointed this out in first service. I don't want to miss this. Moses lived for 40 years thinking he had missed it. He had missed the singular will of God. And for 40 years, he felt like a failure. He lived with that weight on his shoulders and in his heart. And yet what he didn't know is that years ago, God spoke to Abraham. And when he was telling him, hey, you're going to have descendants as many as the stars, right, and grains in the seashore, God told Abraham way, way back that your descendants will be slaves in a foreign country for 400 years. And so when Moses first tried to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, it hadn't been 400 years. It had only been 360. And so Moses was just getting ahead of it a little bit. And so it didn't work out. The word of God had not been fulfilled. And yet God did not waste that season in Moses' life. He thought it was wasted. But like Pastor Ben said last week, if we're seeking the will of God, there is no season in our life that's ever wasted. God took Moses out into the desert, and he continued to bless him. What did he give him? He gave him a wife, a couple of sons, good job. He was stable, he was protected, he had good things going for him. And yet that whole time, he lived with that weight on his shoulder. And so what I want to say to you this morning is maybe what you think is a wasted season in your life, what you might look at as a mistake, I want you to reframe it. And I want you to begin looking at the details of your life in this season and see how God has been blessing you and the things that God has been doing in your life behind the scenes, the growth that you've been experiencing. Think about Moses real quick. Do you think God wanted him to lead those people with a sword as a general or as a staff as a shepherd? They needed that shepherd. They needed somebody who was humble in heart, who would be patient with them just like God was patient with him. And so maybe God is stashing you away, just like he stashed Moses away for those 40 years to grow humility inside of him. I think that was our theme last year, right? Humility. Pastor Ben was talking about that last year. Growing in that humility through that time of anonymity. God was doing stuff in Moses' life, and he's doing stuff in your life right now. Look at somebody near you and say, God is doing something in your life. Whether you see it or not, God is doing it. He knows right where you're at. I'm often reminded of what there's a pastor at Teen Challenge, a wonderful older man of God named Pastor Sam. You know Pastor Sam? And I had many conversations with Pastor Sam. I was going through a time kind of like Moses was going through. And Pastor Sam would say, Mike, God knows your phone number. He knows how to get a hold of you when he needs you. And I think that's exactly where Moses was that day. He went out looking for answers. And God knew how to get a hold of him. Spoke to him out of a burning bush, for crying out loud. Told him, this is my will. This is my calling on your life. And it doesn't matter what other people think about you. It don't even matter what you think about yourself. Just go get her done. And that's exactly what Moses went to do. Look at Exodus chapter 4, verses 29 through 31 again real quick before we close. When we read these verses about Moses, it says he went with Aaron back to Egypt, and he was calling all the elders together and speaking to them and performing the signs and walking forward. When I read through this, I see a man who was moving forward despite what others think, despite his own inadequacies. I see a man not focused on others, not focused on himself, but a man focused on God. And now that he was focused on God, he could embrace the clarity that he received in that burning bush experience. He could always call back to that, no matter how bad it got. No matter if he walked into the Red Sea and the Egyptians are behind him and the people are like, oh, you should have just left us there. No matter when there was no food, no water, and they're complaining and they're crying out. Where was Moses' attention all the time from that point on? To God. It was focused on God. It was like God's calling in his life was just so clear. It really didn't matter what other people thought. It didn't even matter about himself. In fact, several times, God says, I can't stand these people. Just step over here. I will destroy them and start new with you. Did you ever read that? We'll get to that, right? And what did Moses do? Fell on his face and pleaded for the people. No, God, you can't do that. We see him so focused on fulfilling his will and bringing those people to the promised land. And I think the same is true for us. When we get past what others think, when we get past what we think about ourselves, and whether or not we think we're enough, and we get laser focused, super crystal clear about what God wants to do in our lives right now, then that's all that matters. And this sermon will come back to you. That's why I titled it the way I did. Because if you forget everything I say, I don't want you to forget. If God calls us, then we can. Even if others don't believe, even if we don't think we are enough, we can, so long as we remain focused on Him.